Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nurse your mind on the go. This deep dive is brought to you by the magic of AI narration, allowing you to effortlessly absorb wisdom anytime, anywhere. Today, we're taking you on a journey through Karen Armstrong's Fields of Blood, Religion and the History of Violence, to explore a provocative idea. What if religion isn't the primary driver of violence throughout history?
Yeah. It's a common misconception that religion, with its fervent beliefs and devoted followers, has fueled most conflicts, but Armstrong challenges that assumption. She suggests that the roots of violence actually are embedded in the very fabric of civilization itself. Imagine early farmers striving for stability and surplus. Their efforts, while seemingly innocuous, laid the foundation for organized warfare and societal control.
It's a fascinating concept, this idea of inherent violence within civilization. Could you elaborate on how this so-called original sin, as Armstrong puts it, manifested in early societies?
Sure. Let's journey back to ancient Mesopotamia, the birthplace of cities and complex social structures. The need for organized labor and resource management led to hierarchies and power struggles. Armstrong argues that this not religious fervor was the breeding ground for large-scale conflict. For instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest stories, features a king embarking on a violent quest that was actually opposed by the gods.
So even in ancient times, violence wasn't always divinely sanctioned. It seems like you're saying that religion might not have been the primary instigator of violence. So how did it become so intertwined with violence?
Well, think of it this way. The rise of warrior cultures like the Indo-European Aryans played a significant role. They revered a warrior lifestyle and actually looked down on agricultural work, which contributed to a culture of militarization. They even used rituals and mythology to kind of sacralize their dominance. And we see this in other societies too, including the Shang dynasty in China, where power was often legitimized through religious beliefs and practices.
So religion became a tool to justify and solidify existing power structures that were rooted in violence. That's a perspective I hadn't really considered before. But were there any counter movements to this trend? Did anyone challenge this seemingly inherent connection between civilization and violence?
Oh, absolutely. Armstrong highlights figures like Zoroaster, who, after witnessing the brutality of tribal warfare, developed a dualistic worldview pitting good against evil, advocating for a more peaceful and just society.
It sounds like Zoroaster was calling for a kind of moral and spiritual evolution, urging people to transcend their baser instincts and strive for a higher ideal. Were there other figures who echoed this call for a more peaceful path?
Many, in fact. In India, Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, preached radical nonviolence and empathy for all beings. His teachings directly challenged the prevalent warrior ethos of the time. And in war-torn China, Confucius sought to cultivate ethics based on compassion and social harmony, a stark contrast to the ruthlessness of the Qin dynasty.
These individuals were going against the grain, promoting values that really countered the prevailing culture of violence. It's like a testament to the human capacity for both aggression and compassion. But what about the Hebrew Bible? It's often cited as an example of the inherent violence of monotheism. How does that fit into Armstrong's argument?
Well, that's a common misconception. Armstrong argues that the Hebrew Bible, while depicting violence, offers a different perspective compared to other ancient texts. For example, the story of Cain and Abel. It serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive consequences of social disconnect and violence, emphasizing personal responsibility.
So rather than glorifying violence, it seems like the Hebrew Bible is highlighting the importance of social responsibility and the devastating impact of unchecked aggression. Does this theme of grappling with violence continue throughout the Hebrew Bible?
Yes, especially as the Israelites transitioned from nomadic herdsmen to a settled militaristic kingdom. Their own religious narrative reveals the inherent tensions and struggles with violence. They grappled with reconciling their beliefs with the realities of power and conflict.
So it seems like even within the Hebrew Bible, there's an ongoing internal dialogue about the role of violence, a recognition of its complexities and potential for both harm and perhaps necessity. This nuanced perspective on the Hebrew Bible definitely challenges the simplistic notion that it's solely a text promoting violence. Now let's shift our focus to the Roman Empire and the Pax Romana, a period often associated with peace and stability. Does this era represent a departure from the inherent violence Armstrong describes in earlier civilizations?
Not quite. The Pax Romana, while definitely a time of relative peace and prosperity, was built upon and maintained by a powerful military machine. Even as they spread their culture and infrastructure, the Romans ruthlessly crushed any resistance, demonstrating that violence remained a crucial element of their power.
So even during this golden age, the shadow of violence lingered. How did early Christians who emerged under Roman rule navigate this reality?
Well, early Christians, they really struggled with this cloak of violence, especially during times of persecution. Their responses varied. Some advocated for pacifism, while others argued for just war, a concept that tried to limit the scope and brutality of conflict.
So the debate on violence in society and faith has been going on for a long time. It's interesting how those early Christians were already wrestling with these ethical dilemmas that we still face today. But how did this complex relationship between religion and violence evolve over time, especially in the West?
Armstrong argues that the way we even conceptualize religion itself has evolved, particularly in the West, and this has shaped our understanding of religious violence. During the Enlightenment, reason and individual autonomy took center stage. Religion, seen as more emotional and traditional, became kind of compartmentalized, leading to the perception that religious violence was inherently irrational and fanatical.
So the Enlightenment's focus on reason and individual liberty might have unintentionally created this divide between religion and secularism, which influenced how we view violence associated with each. Wouldn't this separation lead to a more peaceful society as religion's influence on political affairs diminished?
Not necessarily. While secularism gained momentum, the horrors of modern warfare, like the World Wars and the Holocaust, really shattered any illusions of inherent peace in a secular world. These events highlighted that both religious and secular ideologies had the potential for destruction.
That's a sobering thought. It seems that the lines between religious and secular violence became blurred, especially in the 20th century, with its unprecedented scale of conflict. How does this historical perspective inform our understanding of violence in the modern world?
Well, Armstrong argues that the modern era presents new complexities, particularly with globalization, terrorism, and religious extremism. Understanding the historical interplay of religion and violence can help us navigate these challenges more effectively.
Can you give us an example of how this historical lens can provide insights into modern conflicts?
Sure, consider Islamic fundamentalism. It's often portrayed as a solely religious phenomenon, but Armstrong contends that it's also a response to the political and social upheavals of the modern world, especially in regions impacted by colonialism and Western intervention.
So instead of viewing these movements as solely driven by religious fanaticism, we need to consider the broader context of political and social injustices that contribute to their emergence. Does this nuanced approach apply to other contemporary issues like terrorism?
Absolutely. Terrorism, regardless of any religious motivations, is inherently a political act aimed at gaining, maintaining, or resisting power. Understanding this is crucial for developing effective counterterrorism strategies.
It seems that simplistic narratives often fail to capture the complex realities of these global challenges. Would you say that Armstrong's work calls for a more nuanced and empathetic understanding of these seemingly intractable conflicts?
Exactly. Her analysis underscores the importance of recognizing the shared humanity of all people, even those we disagree with, and seeking common ground for dialogue and understanding. This resonates with the ethical core of many religious traditions, emphasizing compassion and responsibility towards others.
It's a powerful reminder that even amidst conflict, the potential for peace and reconciliation exists. However, translating these ideals into action in a world grappling with multifaceted challenges seems daunting. How can we as individuals contribute to a more peaceful and just world?
Armstrong suggests that we can begin by challenging our own preconceived notions and engaging in critical thinking. We need to move beyond simplistic narratives of good guys versus bad guys and recognize the complex factors that contribute to conflict. This requires empathy, a willingness to understand different perspectives, and a commitment to seeking peaceful resolutions.
So personal reflection and a commitment to understanding are crucial first steps. But what role does religion play in fostering a more peaceful future? Can it be a force for positive change, or is it inherently tied to conflict, as some suggest?
Armstrong argues that while religion has been used to justify violence, it also has the potential to promote peace. It can be a powerful force for cultivating empathy, responsibility, and a commitment to peace.
That's a hopeful perspective. But how do we tap into this potential for peace, considering the complexities and challenges we've discussed?
Well, Armstrong suggests that we need to rediscover the ethical core of religious traditions and apply those principles to the complexities of the modern world. She emphasizes that these values, such as compassion, forgiveness, and justice, are not exclusive to any one religion or belief system, but represent shared human aspirations for a better world.
This reminds me of the teachings of figures like Zoroaster, Mahavira, and Confucius, who centuries ago called for peace and compassion in a world consumed by violence. Their messages, while rooted in specific religious contexts, offer universal values that can inspire us to build a more just and peaceful world.
Exactly. Armstrong's work reminds us that violence is not an inevitable part of the human condition. It's a choice. a choice that has been shaped by historical forces, social structures, and yes, religious beliefs. But it's also a choice that we can challenge, resist, and ultimately transcend.
Her analysis offers a powerful message of hope that despite the long history of violence, we have the capacity to choose a different path. It's a message that resonates deeply in a world yearning for peace and understanding.
And that's where Armstrong's analysis becomes truly powerful. She challenges us to confront the violence inherent in our own systems and structures, even in the secular West.
So it's not just about pointing fingers at those other people who are supposedly more prone to violence.
Right. Remember how we talked about the rise of the modern nation-state and the secularization of politics? Well, Armstrong argues that this process wasn't always as peaceful and rational as we might think.
You're talking about events like the French Revolution? It started with ideals of liberty and equality, but things got pretty bloody, didn't they?
Exactly. The French Revolution, while inspired by Enlightenment ideals, also unleashed a wave of violence and terror. And as European powers colonized vast parts of the world, they often justified their actions with secular ideologies of progress and national superiority.
So violence became a tool for spreading civilization, even in the name of secular ideals.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
And this pattern continued into the 20th century with the rise of totalitarian regimes like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
But those regimes were driven by ideologies that were explicitly anti-religious rights.
True, but Armstrong argues that they often exhibited quasi-religious characteristics, a fervent belief in their own righteousness, a willingness to sacrifice individuals for the collective good, and a utopian vision of the future that justified extreme measures.
So even when religion wasn't the driving force, these movements still tapped into some of the same psychological and social dynamics that we see in religious violence.
Precisely. And she makes a particularly chilling point about the Holocaust. She argues that it was the ultimate example of social engineering gone wrong, fueled by a secular ideology of racial purity and national superiority.
It's a stark reminder that violence is not exclusive to any one belief system or ideology.
Exactly. And that brings us to the challenges of the 21st century globalization terrorism, the rise of religious extremism. Armstrong argues that understanding the deep historical roots of violence can help us navigate these complexities more effectively.
So we can't just dismiss these issues as solely religious or solely political.
Right. Take the example of Islamic fundamentalism. It's often portrayed as a purely religious phenomenon, but Armstrong points out that it's also a response to the political, economic, and social upheavals of the modern world.
So it's about understanding the context in which these movements arise rather than simply labeling them as irrational or fanatical.
Exactly. And she makes a similar point about terrorism. It's always a political act, even when religious motivations are involved. It's about power, acquiring it, maintaining it, or resisting it.
So even in the face of seemingly senseless acts of violence, we need to look for the underlying political dynamics.
Exactly. And that requires nuanced analysis and a willingness to challenge our own preconceived notions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the origins of organized violence in ancient civilizations to the complexities of religious extremism in the modern world. What's the key takeaway for our listeners? What's the one thing we want them to remember from this deep dive?
It seems like Armstrong's real challenge to us is to look beyond those simplistic explanations and try to understand the deeper historical and social forces that shape how we think about violence. It's like she's calling for intellectual honesty, a willingness to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world we live in.
Exactly. Armstrong's book reminds us that violence isn't some inevitable part of being human. It's a choice. It's a choice that's been shaped by history and social structures, and yes, even religious beliefs. But in the end, it's a choice that we can challenge, we can resist it, and ultimately we can transcend it. That's a pretty powerful message, especially when you consider how much violence humanity has seen throughout history and continues to experience even today. That idea that we have the power to choose a different path, to break free from those repeating cycles of violence, it's a very empowering thought.
It is, and it requires us to recognize that we're capable of both violence and compassion. We need to understand the historical and social forces that influence our choices and really try to make conscious ethical decisions that promote peace and understanding.
So where do we even begin? How do we take this awareness and turn it into meaningful action?
Armstrong suggests a few ways to start. First, she encourages us to really dig into the ethical core of our own traditions, whether they're religious or secular. Those traditions often hold wisdom and principles that can guide us toward more peaceful and just ways of living.
It's about finding that wellspring of compassion and empathy that exists within all of us, regardless of our beliefs or backgrounds.
Right. It's also about recognizing that we're all interconnected. understanding that our actions have consequences. They ripple outwards, impacting not just ourselves, but those around us and the world as a whole.
That interconnectedness seems so important, especially in a world dealing with global challenges like climate change, poverty, and political instability. These problems go beyond national borders, and they demand collective action based on shared responsibility.
Absolutely. Armstrong's work shows how important dialogue is, fostering genuine understanding between people from different backgrounds and beliefs. This means actively listening, being willing to engage with different perspectives, and committing to finding common ground even when there are disagreements.
It's about moving past that us versus them thinking. That often fuels conflict, and instead recognizing our shared humanity.
Exactly. And it requires a commitment to justice, to addressing the systemic inequalities and injustices that so often contribute to violence and unrest.
So it's a multifaceted approach. It involves personal reflection, ethical engagement, and a dedication to building a more just and equitable world.
It is, and it's a journey, not a destination. It requires us to keep putting in the effort, being willing to learn from mistakes, and committing to creating a more peaceful and compassionate world for ourselves and future generations.
This has been a really insightful look at Karen Armstrong's Fields of Blood. Her analysis provides a powerful lens for understanding history and the complex relationship between religion and violence. It's a book that really challenges our assumptions, that makes you think deeply, and ultimately offers a message of hope and possibility.
Absolutely. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the forces that shape our world and what role we can play in creating a more peaceful and just future.
If you're ready to embark on this thought-provoking journey through history and explore the complexities of violence, we highly encourage you to get a copy of Fields of Blood, Religion and the History of Violence by Karen Armstrong. You'll find a link to buy the book in the show notes. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into fascinating ideas. Share this episode with someone you think would appreciate it. And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep seeking a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world we share.